Is from Dr. Jaques de Mouzon, which is currently scientific advisor at Unilabs France Paris, and he's going to talk about art in the world, present data, and future perspectives.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, dear colleagues. First of all, I want to thank the organizing committee, and especially my friends Amelia and Rita, for having invited me to share with you some surveillance data. There are surveillance data. It's not strong research, but I think the surveillance data are very important because ART deals with life, and there are always new technologies, and we need to give data to the professional, to the health authorities, and also to the public itself. So I have nothing to disclose for this topic. Just to be very brief on the history, 78 first tube baby. Now we have imputed that probably more than 7 million babies were born since the beginning, conceived through ART. And on the last report, and there is always some delay between the reports of the world and of the EIM European Register. In the last report, we have more than 1,500,000 cycles reported, which means that we think that there are almost 2.5 million cycles per year. And probably we also estimate that there are almost 500,000 babies born each year through ART. Since a very long time now, it appeared that it was necessary to build surveillance data with especially two important registries. One was EBART with the World Register, which was built in 1989, and the second is the European Register, the EBART Register, which was built in 1997. So I shall show you some data from these two registries, and after, well, it was in my title, elaborate some hypotheses to see what will be the future. So just here to show you that the EBART, the World Report, is based on a lot of countries. I shall come back on the countries later, from all the world. And in Europe, you see here that the green part means that those countries participate in the EBART register, and you see that almost all Europe is green. What we see for the World Report is that the number of countries participating has increased from 20-something to 74 in the last report. And the number of cycles at the beginning in 1991 was approximately 3,000 to 4,000 cycles, and now 1.5 million. So which means a very big increase, and for the last report, it was almost 11% increase. The main contributors are here. The country in which there's the highest number of cycles is Japan now, with almost a little less than 400,000 cycles, followed by US, France, or Spain. But this has changed a little bit. If we look at the last report from EBART, you see that Spain has become the main contributor with more than 100,000 cycles on the last report. And Russia is also increasing a lot. So for the last report, we had 74 countries, which cover, as you saw in the first slide, one of the first slides, almost all Europe, almost all America, North and Latin, some Asian country, and now some African countries also. We miss mostly many countries of Middle East, but also the main countries that we miss is China, and it is very hard to know exactly the number of cycles which are performed in China. We try to bring them to our register, but now we are unsuccessful. Maybe it will arrive in some time. And so we think that we cover approximately 2/3 of the world activity by making some hypotheses on these missing countries. If we look now at the regional distribution of the EBART cycles, you'll see that the most important part comes from Europe. You see this, and it is increasing always. And after, you have Asia, which is increasing, but the other part of the world are much lower. And in the last report, you see that Europe accounted for 47, almost 50% of the cycles, followed by North America and Asia. If we look at the global results, just the global results, we shall go a bit deeper after. You see in 2013, 1.5 million initiated cycles, a little less than 300,000 deliveries, which means an increase of almost 11% for the cycles and 8% for the deliveries from 2012, from the previous report. And we found also new trends. And the new trends, which is the most important, is the freeze-all cycle. And we had almost 85,000 cycles of freeze-all cycle. And it was mostly, at this time, mostly from Japan. In Japan, they do more than 20% of cycles with freeze-all cycle. But in the rate, in the pregnancy rates that you will see later, those freeze-all are excluded from the rate per aspiration, but they are included in the cumulative rate. So if we look at the distribution, which is very nice in this slide, is that the number of sowing of frozen embryo transfer is increasing every year, probably mostly because of the single embryo transfer, which gives more oocyte, more embryo to be frozen. And you see also that there is a tendency to increase here the number of oocyte donation. If we look at the trend between IVF and ICSI, and we had a nice talk from George yesterday on this, and we see that apparently in the world there is a tendency to plateau the percentage of ICSI to 60-something, 65% approximately. But the situation is very different across the regions. And you look, for example, here, that in Middle East, they have 100% of ICSI cycle. In Latin America, 85% of ICSI cycles, much higher than Asia or Europe. And we are sure that it is not because there are more male infertility in those countries. It's the debate is because in these countries they think very often that ICSI will give better results, and which have been proven to be not the reality. But you saw that there are 62%, 65% in Europe, but in fact, it's very different across the countries. So we have the picture of Europe in total, but if you look at the distribution per country themselves, I did not put the name of the countries. I did it. I want to do it. And you see that there are some countries in which you have 100% of ICSI cycles, and some countries in which you have more than 50% of IVF cycles. So there is a big variation in a region towards the ICSI and IVF. If we look now at the delivery rate per aspiration. And these are given by a region in 2013. We cumulate IVF and ICSI, for the reason you know. And we put also the result per fresh cycle and also the result by cumulative cycles. It is not the real cumulative because since we have all the data from 1 year, there is no, it is not a real cohort. So we have taken the habit to add the pregnancy of frozen embryo replacement of the same year. It's not perfect, but it's the only way to have those data every year. And so what you see is that regionally, the highest result come from America, and especially from USA. If both for the fresh rate as the cumulative rate. And you see that the cumulative rate, the difference between fresh and cumulative rates are more important, for example, in Australia and New Zealand, and we shall see later why. And there are not a lot of big difference in Africa and in Latin America because they do less single embryo transfer. But these results are not homogeneous also, which means that even inside Europe, you have a lot of differences, and I put this yellow bar to indicate the average rate in Europe, but you see that according to the countries, there are big differences. And even in a country, I put data from my country, and you see by center, you see there are also a lot of differences by center, which means that the surveillance data are important because we know approximately what is going on in a country, in a region, in the world, but we also have to think always that this is not the real result for each center or for each woman. If we go now to the transfer of 1 or 2 embryos, you'll see here that the evolution since 1998, you see that in Australia and New Zealand, they reach almost 100% very early. And in Europe, we are here, and we are now at more than 84% of transfer with just 1 or 2 embryos. And this is different across the region. If you look now at the delivery rate and the twin rate, the first 2 columns for each region represent the delivery per aspiration in 1998 and 2013. And you see that everywhere there was an increase, almost everywhere, except in Latin America, there was an increase in the delivery rate in each region. And at the same time, you see the twins also, which are the gray bar on the right for each region, which were decreased except for Latin America. And also the triplet pregnancies from 98 to 2013 has decreased a lot. And if we look now at the European results, you'll see that the transfer of 2 embryos remain the most practiced, but you also have this bar with the transfer of 1 embryo, which are increasing every year, which reach now 35%. And probably it will continue to increase in the next future. In the same time, the transfer of 3 and or more than 3 embryos, especially more than 3 embryos, you see 1% now, 1 to 2%. So there are a lot of change during this period. And in Europe also, if you look at the multiple pregnancies, the twin pregnancies are decreasing. They started to 25%, now it's approximately 18%, and also the triplet pregnancy were 4% in 1997, now are 1% also. So the evolution in Europe and in the world in general is a tendency to decrease the number of transferred embryos, which result in a decrease in the multiple pregnancies and not in a decrease of the pregnancy rate, which is very important to consider, which is probably something which can help to push towards the transfer of one to embryos. Now, we go to something which is more questions, the future of ART. And first of all, the number of cycles. Maybe you remember or you know that we live since 2002 with the idea, which was published by John Collins, that if the level of need may be 3,000 cycles per million women per year, the optimal demand may be estimated to 1,500, because probably only 50% of the couples who could deserve, who are infertile, can go to ART. And we live with that idea that 1,500 cycles per million women is the basis. And if we think that it is a basis, it is really basis. If we think that the world has approximately 7 billion people, more than 7 billion people in 2007, that means that we could have 11 million cycles at least, or more if we have if we have more than 1,500 cycles per million. And the current is less than 2.5 million. And if the practice of ART still increases at the same level as the previous year in the world, which means 10 to 11% per year, we could reach this number in 2027, which is far from now. And at this time, the world population will have increased also. So, but which is curious in a way is that even in the countries where we know exactly all the production because they have registries which are almost perfect, which give 100% or almost 7%. And you see here a selection of countries, 9 countries, a little less than 200 million people. And you see that globally, most of them have increased. They started, I selected those with more than the limit given by Colin. You see they started from here, and they arrived here. Most of them increased, and if I make an average increase, you see that the average increase in the total of these 9 countries was 45%. So the countries where ART is the most practiced are the countries where the increase is the highest. And this is questionable. And if I look now at the countries in which there were between 700, 750, 100 and little and less than 1.5, then less than 1,500,000 cycles per million, the increase is just 10%. And in the countries in which there are still much less at the beginning, around 500 or less, you see that the tendency is unclear, and maybe it could be 30% from here to there. So it is not clear if the idea to go to 1,500,000 cycles per million is everywhere, is totally the same in the world. And I found it very interesting and curious to see that the countries in which there are the most number of cycles now are the countries where there is also the highest level of increase. So, but if we want to know to evaluate a little bit more the demand for the future, we also have to think about the evolution of fertility. We know now, I think it's well established, that there is a decrease in male fertility in most countries, probably due to environment. But it is uncertain now at which level this has a traduction on the infertility itself. The spermiogram is decreasing, but it doesn't mean that the male infertility has increased, at least now. Maybe it will arrive, and we don't know exactly for women. There are not a lot of publications on the impact of environment on female infertility. So it's a question mark. I want also to share with you a paper which was published by Fadi in 2017. And it is a paper by Demograph. And they made a demographic projection of what could arrive in 2100. And they made this by the assumption of the increase of the number of cycles first, but also taking into account the babies from the infertile patients treated by ART and their babies and their grandson and granddaughters also, grandchildren. And they computed that the estimation was probably between 160 and 400 million people originated by themselves or by their parents or grandparents from ART at the level of 2100, which means that a lot of people, so a lot of responsibilities. We also do not have idea of how the recent technique evolution will impact this. For example, oocyte freezing for fertility preservation for age. I must say publicly that we do not, as a professional, never use the term of social freezing, because for women it's not social. It's a fertility preservation for age decline, okay, fertility, but we must remove of our words, and especially when we talk with journalists and with health authorities, the word of social freezing, because you move a flag, a red flag that they want to take. But so it is arriving now, and we do not have any idea of how it will increase in the coming years, and it could increase the number of cycles, sure. It's the same for nuclear transfer, mitochondrial donation, ovarian tissue regeneration, and all these techniques will probably impact, and we don't know exactly at what level, the number of cycles. If we look now at what we could think about the level of results, you look here that the fresh pregnancy rate per aspiration for fresh cycle was increasing in Europe, but now is plateauing. There is no more increase. But in the same time, you remember that we have more and more frozen embryo replacement. And there is an increase in the pregnancy rate, oocyte donation, but also in frozen embryo replacement for couples. You see the increase. Now we reach almost more than 20% pregnancy. So this evolution can change a little bit at a certain level the number of babies which are produced through ART in the next future. So we have also, so to almost conclude, we have a relative stability of the success rate for fresh cycle. We have an increase of success rate for frozen embryo replacement. We have a decrease in the number of transferred embryos and an increase on the single embryo transfer. We have a decrease in multiple pregnancies, an increase in freeze-all, and I think even in my country now it is increasing more and more, and an increase in oocyte freezing. And we also have methods to try to choose to have a better transfer rate by endometrium or genetic testing. There are more and more papers on this. So the results, for me, are still not predictable, really. However, I think that we have to use good tools for evaluation of ART. And the best, for me, the only one which is very important is the cumulative pregnancy rate or delivery rate per aspiration, and not a rate per cycle, and not a rate per transfer. Because if you, for example, with a freeze-all, you compare pears and apples if you compare fresh cycles and frozen embryo replacement cycles. So I think the necessity is to go more and more towards a cumulative pregnancy rate and or delivery rate, and also maybe to the cumulative delivery rate per couple treated. So in conclusion, we have 2.5 million cycles per year now, with more than 500,000 babies. Still, several countries are unknown, and especially China, which is a problem. We have relatively stable results, but many differences according to the region, the countries, and the clinics. And the future could be 11 million cycles in 2027, maybe more, maybe less, and 160 to 400 million people conceived through ART from parents or grandparents or themselves in 80 years from now. And we do not have any knowledge, any correct knowledge to evaluate the impact of the new techniques, of the new technology. Thank you.
Yeah.
The microphone. Yeah.
I would say 2 short questions because we have time for the coffee break.
Is this working? Yes, it is working. Thank you, Jacques, very much. Just one comment rather than a question, actually. The correlation of the similar finding you have in countries who are increasing most and where there's already the highest proportion of cycles per million population or whatever you measure for million women in the fertile age is due to funding. Is due to funding. There's lots of evidence already. The more generous a state is, and Denmark and Belgium, the more they will practice it. And this is why, and access, which is the main problem for equity and justice in Europe, and certainly even worse in other parts of the world, is that what's important. Because if the funding is there, as the Belgium has proven with reimbursement by insurance, Denmark is very generous, etc. So it's a coincidence, but I think it can be explained by that.
No,
mostly.
I totally agree on that. And for example, if you look at the level of the US, they have just 500. But it's not only a question of economy. Because if you look France, for example, France, we are just at 1,300 something, and we are probably the most generous country because we offer 4 full cycles for 1 pregnancy. And if the pregnancy failed, you still go back to the first, so you have still 4 more cycles. And we have not the highest level. So it's not only a question of, even if economy is a big driver.
Yeah.
Another question? Yeah.
Microphone, please.
Yes. Yeah.
Very, very briefly. So you mentioned on how to register numbers and outcomes. And you also advocate the use of per oocyte aspiration or per cycle. But I see that the whole cycle logic is completely falling apart. So we tend to think in a treatment cycle. But I see segmented cycles. I see pooling of oocytes across many stimulation cycles, which then results with or without PGD or PGS in one transfer. I see carryover of gametes between cycles that are being thought in different cycles, etc. And I wonder if we can uphold the cycle story and still combine data from different countries across different settings in a sensible way. And I wonder what is your comment on that, and if there's a future way to do that in a more sensible way.
Thank you. I think it is a very important question. And one of the problems is that when you deal with registries, you deal with what the country is able to register. And you cannot invent. And so I think that the future, maybe the future which could solve that, would be to have a cooperation between the registries which have individual data and which have individual data for all the cycles, and with a possibility of link. Because, for example, for us in France, it's not easy to link because there is always a fear that that could go in bad hands. But I think the future is sure to be able to compute data with countries which have those basic data. But for now, if each time we want to modify the form from the registries, we have some complaints because it's more work and it's more, and all the countries and all the centers are not equipped to make this change. But yeah.